Hi everyone, my name's Safdar Ahmed.
Oh, sorry.
This is going to take all day. Sorry.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name's Safdar Ahmed.
And I'm Can Yalcinkaya.
And we're recording this video from the Refugee Art Project studio in Thurning Villa, Ashfield. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which this video is being recorded, the Gadigal and Wongal people of the Darug Nation. We acknowledge their elders, past and present, recognising that sovereignty was never ceded. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Can, we're here to talk about Can's comics. So, Can, could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Can Yalcinkaya. I'm an academic cartoonist and musician. And I've been making comics, I guess, more professionally in the last 12 years or so in Australia. And I've tried to, I guess, combine all different aspects of my practices together, like academia, comics, and music together. And I guess we'll talk a bit more about that today.
Looking forward to it. Let's start with the origin story. This is always a good question to begin with. What was your gateway to comics? How did you get into comics?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Turkey, and I moved to Australia in my mid-20s. So my introduction to comics was in Turkey when I was about 6 years old, I think. I got a copy of this comic called Diabolik, which is an Italian
yes.
comic book series. And it was interesting because it's like an anti-hero character, and it's, who's a villain, who's maybe like a thief involved in crime. But he was like the main character in this comic. And I remember seeing this, and I wasn't able to read that much at the time. So I remember just flicking through the pages, and I was like really drawn into the action and like this mysterious character who's wearing like this black costume and the sense of adventure and thrill. So I think that really drew me into this world of comics and this way of storytelling. And soon after that, I got introduced to lots of different, I guess, more age-appropriate comics, like Lucky Luke, 1010, Asterix, and things like that. More from the Franco-Belgian tradition of comics. So I was lucky in the sense that at that time in the 80s, there were a lot of comics that were being translated into Turkish from other cultures. So that would be French language comics, as well as Italian comics, American comics like Spider-Man and Superman, and also like the Marvel comics as well. And so I grew up in that environment where I had access to comics from various different traditions, as well as like the local Turkish comics themselves. So there was a big culture of satirical, humorous periodical comics in Turkey.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you about that because I guess most people, well certainly most Australians, have no idea about the comics culture in Turkey, its influences, but also how creative and innovative it is. Could you say a little bit about comics in Turkey?
For sure, like it's been the Turkish comics has a really long history as well, like even starting from the late 19th century with like cartoons and like publications that were dedicated to, I guess, this sort of graphic storytelling formats. So using lots of illustrations and like humorous cartoons and things like that. And that tradition continued for a long time, and even to this day, even though it's sort of been impacted by the internet and the price of paper and things like that. So there's not as many as many of these comics magazines as there used to be, but certainly they became really popular from like the 50s onwards, and especially in the 1970s. There was this comics magazine called Gırgır, which has been really influential on the Turkish comics makers, comics artists, and comics traditions.
And is that a satirical magazine or what? Yeah.
Yeah, it was like a weekly satirical magazine that was published by a famous cartoonist called Oğuz Aral. And what it did was it opened up its pages to lots of young cartoonists, and it sort of served as like the purpose of like it served the function of a school in a way for cartoonists, where these young people who were like interested in making comics or drawing cartoons would go every week to Gırgır, and they would show their cartoons to the editor, Oğuz Aral, and he would give them feedback, and if they're like really talented, he would give them a page to draw every week. So it's like 16 pages of tabloid format comics each week. And at one point, it was so popular, it was selling like 500,000 copies a week or something.
Wow.
Which is like, you know, like compared to any other comics culture around the world, it was like they were really high numbers, especially compared to now. And that magazine, that format of 16 tabloid format pages a week became like almost a template for comics in Turkey for a long time. And there were so many kind of comics that came from that tradition, sometimes creating their own, I guess, their own outlook. Like Gırgır was sort of politically maybe central left, but there were magazines that were coming out that were a bit more radical left, or there were magazines who were on the right wing of the spectrum who was kind of responding to that sort of leftist tradition in comics in a different way.
And so is this stuff sort of like gag cartooning? Is it more like underground cartooning? What's the actual influence? Would you say it was European satirical cartooning?
For sure. For Gırgır, I remember reading that Oğuz Aral, the editor and the main cartoonist in Gırgır, was really influenced by actually Walt Disney. So he was like studying books of Walt Disney about how he draws like his characters, like Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and things like that. So it's like very in the cartoony gag cartoon tradition, but it was also influenced somewhat by maybe European comics, like the Ligne Claire French style, more simple kind of drawing of cartoons. And one of Oğuz Aral's famous mottos at the time was avoid unnecessary hatching. So he wouldn't want people to do like lots of hatching or shading or things like that in the cartoons. So there was actually a tradition of cartoonists who rebelled against it, and they would be like doing more like cross hatchings and like more shading and making their drawings a bit more complex.
Sort of like American underground comics, would you say?
Definitely.
Was there an influence there as well?
Yeah, I think when I did my master's thesis on Turkish satirical comics, especially like two magazines, Lemanyak and Lombak. And those magazines I felt were like definitely more influenced by the American underground comics. And when I asked some of the cartoonists who were involved in those magazines whether they were like actually influenced by these underground comics, like Robert Crumb's work, they were like, yes, like I really enjoyed Robert Crumb's work. So there was a bit of that, but I don't know if that was really influential for that generation in the 1970s. I don't think they were exposed to that much, but they were definitely seeing like Mad Magazine and things like that, and maybe there was some influences from Mad Magazine, especially like how they do the film parodies and Mad. So there were things like that happening in these, like especially in Gırgır.
Interesting.
Yes, and they did also have more, I guess, not just like single panel gag cartoons, but lots of like comics, ongoing comics series, which would be maybe 1 or 2 pages a week, and sometimes that the story would end in that same issue, but sometimes it would be like an ongoing story that would be like serialized in a way. So I think that was like, again, another very influential tradition of comics for me. And I think I kind of still follow that sort of type of cartooning and that type of action maybe in the comics that I try to make.
Yeah, that's great. And we're going to get up to your work next. Yeah, tell me how you got into making comics. How does one transition from, being a comic lover to actually starting out and making your own? Yeah,
I guess like from early on when I first saw comics as a child in Turkey. And then there was another actually very influential moment for me where I was in primary school again, maybe I was 10 or 11 years old. And I had a friend who brought like this photocopied magazine that he made which was like cut-ups from other children's magazines and some of his own drawings and writing or something. And he photocopied it, and he was like bringing it to school to sell copies of this
like
magazine,
a bootleg,
like a bootleg or like a zine that he made, like a cut-up collage zine or something.
Wow.
And I mean, I didn't know anything about fanzines or zines at that time, but just gave me this sense of, oh, like this is like something I can do, like anyone can do this kind of work, put it together. So as a child, what I was doing was like I would have like post-it notes where I would just draw one panel of a story and then another panel on the next page, and then I would just put them together with a staple, so it would be my little sort of mini comic.
Nice.
So that was, I guess, my introduction to making comics, and I always had the sense that I can do this, like I can make comics. But I didn't actually start making them more professionally, I guess, up until I moved to Australia. So I was doing a PhD in Australia, and after I finished that coincided with the Gezi Park protests that were just like starting in 2013. And I was like thinking, oh, this is just like such a momentous period in Turkish history. Like these people are rebelling against the government. Just as I guess a summary of what was going on at the time. So there was some government plans to knock down this park in Istanbul called Gezi Park. And there were a few protesters who were kind of doing a sit-in protest at the park and trying to stop the construction machines. And there was a big sort of police crackdown on these people, which then like instigated this massive protest movement. And all these people kind of went to Gezi Park to protect the park. But also there were protests happening all across Turkey because there was some growing discontent with the government of Turkey at the time. And we were seeing this like clashes with the police every day, people doing like really creative stuff in terms of their activism, their protest. There was like a lot of music coming out, graffiti coming out, films and things like that, inspired by the Gezi movement. And I was in Australia, and I was like, oh, this is so inspiring. Like, I want to be part of this somehow. So I asked some friends online whether they would be interested in putting together a comics anthology. So we decided to create an anthology called Resist Comics. And it took us like almost 2 years to do that. But how it happened was everyone was in different parts of the world. Like we had people in Europe, a lot of people in Turkey, obviously. I was in Australia. We were coordinating online. Some of us were writing like scripts for the comics, and we were kind of finding artists who were interested in illustrating these scripts. And it took a while, but we were able to do like a crowdfunding campaign and raise the funds to print it in Australia. And we also got like a book deal in Turkey, so it was published by a Turkish publisher as well around the same time in 2014. And we published the English edition through crowdfunding in 2015. And that, I guess that introduced me to the comic scene in Australia in a way, because as I was doing that, I met lots of people who were making comics in Australia. So my I guess academic work at the time was focusing on Turkish culture, Turkish media mainly. I did my PhD in media. So I was looking at the cultural aspects of melancholy in Turkish popular cinema and popular music. And it was a very much like a traditional sort of thesis where I was doing a lot of textual analysis of work like films and music, and looking at it from like a critical cultural theory perspective. So as I finished that PhD thesis and I graduated, like it just was actually a few days before the Gezi protest started. So I was kind of closing that part of my life a bit. I was still, of course, working at the uni as a tutor and lecturer casually, but I was sort of ready to do something a bit different. And then when I started getting into comics that way through Resist Comics and started meeting Australian cartoonists and comics makers, it became I guess, a transition period for me where I was sort of moving a bit away from the academic work a bit and getting into the creative work.
Great. And so the Resist anthology came out. I think that's around the time we met, isn't it?
That's correct.
And that's when you started making comics that bring your sort of political passions and interests into a sort of creative form.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, like you said, we met around 2014, I think, and when it was towards the end of us completing the Resist Comics anthology, and it was getting ready to be printed. And at the time, actually, I'll thank you in front of the camera, because you were helping me with the layout of Resist Comics.
That's right. You didn't know how to use InDesign, and I managed to bring all the panels inside the page.
That's right, because we were having like a bit of difficulty with printing.
That's right.
The comic, and your help really, helped us fix the problem, and so that was a good sort of the start of a beautiful friendship and collaboration. And then we also discovered that we had lots of common interests in terms of comics making, zines,
music,
horror films, and things like that. And then we started chatting, and we decided to start a band.
Our band is called Hazine. Anti-racist Muslim death metal band.
That's correct. And that was I guess a great another great aspect of getting into this creative and cultural scene. Not just making comics, but also making music and exploring a different aspect of, I guess, creativity through that.
Yeah, I think it's around that time that I also really got into making my own zines, doing my own comics, and embracing that DIY ethos. And really understanding that, we don't need to search for cultural forms that reflect our subjectivity. We can make our own. You make your own culture.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and that was, I think, an ethos that I carried with me since I was a teenager, because before I moved to Australia, when I was a teenager especially, I was part of that DIY zine making and underground music culture a bit in Turkey as well. So I used to play in different bands, like metal bands back in Turkey. I made zines with friends, in collaboration, and I always had the sense that I should be doing things myself or in collaboration with others, to be part of these underground communities where we don't really need permission from anyone to be creative and to make art and publish comics or writing or record our music and release it on tape or online or whatever. We had the means to do that, and I think finding that sort of community and creativity again in my 30s have been really life-changing for me.
And tell me about your earliest short comics. Some of your earliest comics were about music and Turkish culture. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess in the time that I was working on Resist Comics, I was meeting different Australian cartoonists like Pat Grant and Sam Wallman and you and other cartoonists in Sydney. And I remember at the time Sam Wallman was making an anthology called Fluid Prejudice, which was a comics anthology on Australian history, but alternative Australian histories that are not maybe commonly discussed in mainstream culture. And for that I made a little one-page comic in contribution, and it was about the time queer Turkish singer Zeki Müren visited Australia back in the 70s. And it was in the news, in newspapers, and the funny thing was, I guess that this is in the comic, where it was newsworthy that some male fans of Zeki Müren came and kissed him on the cheeks or something, and it was these Turkish migrants are kissing another man on the cheeks or whatever. So it was it was newsworthy, and it was in the newspaper.
But obviously, in Turkish culture, I'm assuming, much like many Asian cultures, men kissing each other on the cheeks.
Yeah,
is just
they
a
hold
normal,
hands, they kiss each other on the cheeks.
normal homosocial behavior. Not
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it wasn't like anything queer in the Turkish context at all.
Right.
But anyway, so that was a comic, the first, I guess, very short comic that I made, that was published in Australia. And then I also did another bit longer, like a six-page comic in the next anthology that Sam edited. Which
That was
called,
the one about class, wasn't it?
Yeah, if we all spell at once, they drown.
That's right.
So I made a comic about Turkish arabesque music, which has got like kind of working class connotations in the Turkish context. But the comic was about this Turkish rock band who came to Sydney and they played a gig. And the whole set was kind of covers of all these old arabesque songs which had the working class, like rural migrant, working class people kind of connotations.
So for the viewers, arabesque music, how would you define it briefly?
So
it's like a
arabesque music is, I guess, is seen as a hybrid musical genre in Turkey. It brings together elements of like Turkish classical music, but also Turkish folk music, which is then mixed with maybe some like Western styles of Western instruments and Western styles of playing. So a lot of cultural critics in the 60s and 70s, when arabesque music was becoming popular, really criticized it because they saw it as some sort of degeneration of like traditional musical styles like classical Turkish music or folk music. But it really resonated with the working class people in big cities who moved from villages to like the big city to find work, and it resonated with them because there's a lot of like stories of suffering and not finding your place and feeling like you're displaced and alienated somehow. So I think that sort of emotion was really resonant. But then I guess as time goes by, these sentiments become a bit more mainstream maybe, and more like the wider public starts finding them a bit more maybe nostalgic and finds a bit of themselves in it. So I guess that was part of my focus in that comic, in that short comic. And then that was kind of a good thing to do because it gave me a sense of how I can turn my like research interests into non-fiction comics somehow.
And that, I think, is a good introduction to Taksim, which is a bigger project that you're currently working on. Can you describe that?
Yeah, so Taksim was the next project after that I started after this comic for Sam's anthology. And I did two issue zine about, I guess, being a migrant and the sort of importance of music from your homeland when you're a migrant in a strange country. And it was an autobiographical work. That was, I guess, my first sort of autobio comics in a way. I mean, there was an autobiographical aspect to the Wounds of Difference comic, which was in Sam's anthology. But this was more focusing on my experience as a migrant who, brought CDs and cassettes and records from Turkey to Australia as like aspects of like a material culture from my homeland. So it wasn't just like the music itself that's meaningful, but also the objects that we carry with us when we move to another country from our homeland. And the inspiration was actually I was like browsing records in like an op shop, and I came across like a bunch of Greek records, and then I was like, oh, this is amazing! Like I've never seen like these kinds of records in an op shop before in Australia, and I was like, I bought a few of those Greek records, and then I kept coming across like Lebanese records or like records from other countries. And then I was like, how did these records come here? Like, why are they in the op shop? Like, maybe these, like first generation migrants, when they moved to Australia back in the 70s, brought them with them, and then their children now, got rid of them because they're just like old technology, No one listens to them anymore. They don't need records to listen to music anyway, so they're seen as unnecessary objects being discarded. And then because I also have lots of like records in physical media as a collector, and I was thinking, and I have children, and I was like thinking, when I'm older, when I'm like dead, will my children actually donate my records to the op shop, and what's going to become of all this treasure that I brought with me? And it won't be like it will be someone else's trash, maybe. So the CAWnversation project started with that sort of those kinds of feelings and sentiments, and I was like kind of exploring, I guess, like this idea of migration to Australia from the Balkans and the Middle East. I mean, there's a lot of Greek migration to Australia, migration from Lebanon, like Turkish people obviously as well, living in Australia. And I was looking at like those migration stories in the context of the White Australia policy and the racism that these migrants faced, and how music was maybe some solace to them in this sense of being estranged and being in a foreign country, and how it sort of helped them maybe get by and live their life in maybe somewhat hostile environment to them. And especially thinking about the pre-internet times where the only way that people could listen to music was just through records, and when you're moving to a different country and you have limited luggage space, like you have to be really picky about what you're bringing, and maybe if you're bringing music here, then like it's taking up precious space from something else that you might want to bring. So I was really interested in those kinds of stories with CAWnversation.
Yes, and I think that leads me to ask you about a very strange cultural artifact, and that is homo tea.
That's right.
Can you explain what is homo tea, and why did you feel inspired to make a comic about it?
So to explain, Homo tea is a Turkish film which was Homo tea was an adaptation of E.T., Steven Spielberg's 1984 film. And it was, I guess, meant as a parody, written, directed, and starring Müjdat Gezen, who was a famous Turkish comedian. And the idea was that there's an alien like E.T. visiting Earth, but this alien is gay, and he meets this Turkish journalist who's played by Müjdat Gezen, who's the writer and the director of this film as well. And Homo tea falls in love with Müjdat Gezen's character, but his love is unrequited because this guy's straight and he has a girlfriend, and Homo tea is very sad, and he goes through lots of different emotions, and he meets other people and becomes friends with them, one of whom is like a gay man, and the gay man kind of tries to tell him about what being gay means in Turkey or on Earth in general. So then Homo tea is like I'm gonna go back to my planet, and I will just be, this planet is not for me. So it's just like a very strange phenomenon. It's very low budget, and it was direct to video, I think, at the time, and not many people knew about it until someone digitized it and uploaded it to YouTube.
Okay.
So that's how it became kind of a cult movie somehow in the last maybe 15 years or so. And I heard about it and I was like, oh, this is amazing. Because I have an interest in like these sort of Turkish remakes or low budget sort of action, fantasy, sci-fi, horror films made in Turkey.
Yeah, I think a famous example, well, sort of famous in underground circles, is the Turkish adaptation of Star Wars, right?
That's right, yeah. And that was mainly stealing like scenes, like original footage from Star Wars, and adding it into like the film's sort of narrative somehow. It wasn't a direct adaptation, it was more like this space adventure with two characters who also, fight lots of different aliens. So there's some like similarities. but it became known as Turkish Star Wars because it was stealing so many scenes from the original Star Wars movie. Yeah, so it's like a very strange phenomenon, and there's like, I guess, lots of things to discuss about, copyright law and how they evaded that and made adaptations without really paying any royalties to the original filmmakers. And there's lots of remakes of Hollywood films in Turkish cinema made in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. So yeah, this was like an area that I'm interested in, and Homoti was a really fascinating example. And
do you think Spielberg ever heard about Homoti? Do you know if there's been a... Okay.
I haven't heard that. He might have, because it's become really famous in a way, and it's been written about in like American blogs and people all around the world, in Europe and Brazil, and I took it to different places where I was like selling comics, and people always find it like hilarious and fascinating. So I guess I sort of contributed to making it a bit more like popular around the world as well. Yeah, so the comic, I guess, was an attempt for me to do like an academic comic, and it was originally published in this online peer-reviewed academic publication called CAWnversation.
Mm-hmm.
And that was an online journal that was aiming to publish research in comics medium, which is something that I'm really interested in. And they had a special issue on queerness, I think. So I was finding out about Homoti at the time, and I thought, oh, maybe I'll do a comic about Homoti and explore this, like the queerness in Turkish culture as represented in this movie. So that ended up being like I think an 11 or so page comic, where it's very text heavy as well. So one thing that I struggle with is, when you're making academic work or research comic, there's a lot you want to say, but then you may not be able to draw as many pages, because then it may end up being a long form comic, and you don't really have that time to make something that long form. When you're making something non-fiction, and it's not necessarily a story that you're telling, the same kind of storytelling devices that you would use in a comic doesn't always apply, and you're at risk of doing lots of talking heads or something that might be a bit boring in the comics medium. So you really need to think about how you can visually represent like your research, find maybe different, visual metaphors or different storytelling techniques. Or what I try to do is like making that a bit autobiographical, so showing yourself and your own stake and your own interest in this research project, and telling the story of how the research takes place, maybe. Okay, so yeah, and I felt like when you're researching any topic as an academic, you should be a bit more present maybe in your research, and you should really be showing where you're coming from and where your knowledge is being generated from as a person, and showing everything, warts and all, maybe in the comic itself. And because comics is a visual medium, and you're drawing yourself as the researcher who's sort of writing about this topic, then it gives you, I guess, a possibility of doing that and showing yourself visually to the reader, and to acknowledge, your own situated knowledges and what's at stake in the work.
I think that's important, right? There's that self-reflexive element, which is there in Joe Sacco's work, and I think all of the best graphic journalism.
Exactly.
Because it doesn't pretend to have this God's eye view of the subject matter that's being discussed. It sort of shows how the investigator, the artist, the journalist, whoever it is also influencing that environment just by being there.
Yeah.
So there's that self-critical aspect, which I think is crucial in graphic storytelling.
That's right. So there's no pretense of objectivity, and you are showing that it's a very subjective way of investigating and writing and producing knowledge. So I think comics definitely has the potential to do that because of its visual nature mainly.
Yes. This is Gurbat Fuzz, your latest comic, out now through Glom Press. Can you tell us about this? And we'll flip through it.
Yeah, so I guess unlike my other comics work, which has been mostly non-fiction, this is a fiction comic series, and this is the first issue. This is a story about Savaş, who's like a young punk rocker, second generation Turkish-Australian migrant living in Auburn in Sydney with his family. He's in a punk band called the Unstrayans, and in the introduction to the story, the band is playing a gig and they get attacked by these neo-Nazi skinheads. So the comic tells the story of Savaş and his family, who are joined by Savaş's grandmother, Tülay, and Tülay just comes to Sydney from Turkey after losing her husband. And she brings with her some old Turkish records from the 60s and 70s, then introducing Savaş to this history of Turkish psychedelic rock. And we see different family dynamics in the first issue, setting up some, I guess, narrative threads, which I will follow through in later issues with Savaş's dad.
That's dad praying.
Dad praying in the back room. He has agoraphobia, which we will explore a bit more later on. And Savaş's conflicts with his dad, and the other kind of relationships in the family. And then through through his grandmother, Savaş is discovering the history of Turkish music a bit more, and becomes more interested in, I guess, playing that sort of music. But that's not really covered in issue 1. So if you want to find out, you will have to wait for issue 2. But of course, there's also some conflict brewing with the neo-Nazis kind of planning to take down the punks, especially the people of color in the punk scene, who are dominating maybe the discourse in the inner west of Sydney. So they just want to clean inner west of these sort of people of color punks.
And I like some of the stylistic features of this comic, the sort of retro psychedelic kind of psych rock influences that you've got here.
Yeah. And that's a bit of a...
And there's a throwback to arabesque, which you were talking about before.
Yeah, and actually these images of the arabesque singers are swiped from my comic that was in Sam's anthology that I mentioned earlier. And as I was saying, going back to what we were discussing before, the style is very much like influenced by the Turkish humor magazine kind of traditions. This sort of like humorous comic style and bit of action, bit of slapstick almost in the fight scenes earlier on. And I also, if we go back to the very beginning, like these kind of sound effects are also like chot and küt, chotang. These are like sound effects that are used in these like old Turkish comics magazines. So I brought that back to, even though it's in English, I brought the, I guess, Turkish sound effects back into this comic, which I thought, I don't know, I just wanted to show that, I guess, make an homage to like the old Turkish comics that I grew up reading.
Yeah, and I love the the conclusion, because you're bringing in some of the old magic realism with the jinn as well, which is fantastic.
The jinn and the Shahmaran, who's the queen of serpents in Middle Eastern mythology, I guess. And they're coming into the comic as characters at the end. Yeah.
Fantastic. So that's Glom Press, the Gorbet Fuzz, issue 1. How many issues are there going to be for
planning 5 issues at the moment. So this is issue 1. And then the 32 pages, and hopefully it will be in total 5 32 issue pages.
Fantastic. Love it. So everyone, go out and grab the Gorbet Fuzz. Yeah,
Thank you.
I think that's it.
Thanks, Matt. Sorry.
I think, should there be a conclusion? I think that's fine.
Yeah.